Joining us from Shanghai is Chen Dongxiao. He's president of the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. With us here in Washington is the director of the Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, Dan Ikenson. And joining us from London is the management editor of The Economist, Adrian Woolridge, a collection of his columns entitled The Great Disruption: How Business is Coping with Turbulent Times, comes out next month. Gentlemen, thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go to London and Adrian. Adrian, we have had an economic system, an international economic system in place since the end of World War II, that system's been dominated by the World Bank and the IMF. Now we have the emergence of the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. How significant is this?
Well, massively significant. The most important development of our time, really, is the rise of Asia. And the most important development within that is the rise of China. So this bank, which is essentially something which has been created and sponsored by China, is a symbol of this huge change that is going on, just as the creation of the IMF and the World Bank was a symbol of the American century. This is a symbol of a century that won't just be the American century, which will also be a century of partnership with Asia.
Dr. Chen, how much of this is politics? Are we seeing here a competition between the United States and China for global influence?
Well, you will see that it has shown that the United States are a little bit nervous about what kind of role China would play in the global economic governance. And I think that they are not quite sure that whether China is going to rebuild a new kitchen or will continue to work with the United States or Western power in just the same old kitchen. But if we check the whole pictures between the U.S. and China's the economic relationship, you will see that we have also seen quite a number of common interests, common concerns with the global economies, like to continue to have an open and transparent trade systems. We have worked quite closely, try to make a more stable and strong financial systems. And also both sides recognize the importance of imbalance of a growth economy is the root cause of the latest round of financial and economic crisis. So I think that both sides have worked together to try to transform their domestic economic reform respectively to try to make the global economy much more balanced. So in that regard, I think that both sides actually, yeah, there's competition, but also a lot of cooperation. That's the more balanced picture.
And Dan, what do you make of it? Is the emergence of this bank, does it complement existing organizations like the World Bank or the IMF, or is this an attempt to supplant them?
No, I think it's complementary. I think the way the United States has reacted suggests that it's more competitive. But, you know, the U.S. was the primary author of the post-Second World War global economic architecture. It has been an architecture that has produced profound benefits for most countries around the world to peace and prosperity. And China has benefited considerably from that. And the United States has asked China to be more of a responsible stakeholder in global affairs, and this is a manifestation of that. And the U.S. should be welcoming of it. However, there's a little bit of suspicion, a little reluctance. I think the kind of thing you'd expect when an incumbent power needs to accommodate a rising power. There's just a little bit of reluctance, but the United States needs to recognize that this is a good thing, and this is a way that we can all partake of the benefits of China's growth.
Adrian, there certainly is an element of alarm here in the United States. If one looks at the way some officials here have been responding to it, a recent Washington Post opinion piece written by the former Treasury Secretary and Harvard President, Lawrence Summers, he said, and he was writing this at the beginning of April, he said, this past month may be remembered as the moment the United States lost its role as the underwriter of the global economic system. What do you make of that?
Well, the point is that the United States will not have the same degree of dominance in the 21st century that it did in the 20th century. So Summers is really trying to shore up and preserve a world that can't be shored up, that can't be preserved. The great game at the moment is how to accommodate the rise of China. We need to accommodate the rise of China much, much better than we accommodated the rise of Germany in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We need to make sure that China has its voice heard in the global stage. We haven't been doing that particularly well. If you look at the current architecture of the global system, you know, the IMF is something that is basically run by a European, a French person. It seems to be almost always these days. That's a very odd way of doing things, really, given the rise of the emerging world. Just to give it to a French person, and the World Bank, is a quid pro quo run by an American. I think that some of what's happening in the emerging world and in China is proof of the inflexibility of these institutions, a failure of these institutions to accommodate the rise of new powers and to listen to their voices. So I think we need to have a much more thoroughgoing rethinking of who runs the IMF, who runs the World Bank, who has their voices heard. And this is quite an important warning to the United States and to incumbent powers in general. They shouldn't just sit there and think that the old order and the old way of doing things can be preserved. Of course it can't in this new world. Power is very rapidly devolving. America's not losing power completely, but it has to share power with emerging countries in the emerging world, and particularly with China.
Dr. Chen, earlier this year, President Obama was very blunt in his assessment of the competition between the United States and China. Let's listen to what he said.
China wants to write the rules for the world's fastest growing region. That would put our workers and our businesses at a disadvantage. Why would we let that happen? We should write those rules. We should level the playing field.
What does China make of those sentiments, Dr. Chen?
If we compare notes of what the Chinese believe of the existing international institutions, economic institutions, as well as those roadmaps that the United States and the Western powers continue to pursue their policy, we're seeing that there are some differences. But in general, if we see those fundamental principles that both sides shared a lot in terms of continue to push forward a more open and liberalized trade system, both at the regional as well as at the global level. Both sides agree that it's very important to continue to uphold a very strong and stable financial systems. And both sides also agree that the economic reform with regard to those multilateral institutions should be accelerated, though we have also seen that some of the problems actually had existed within the United States. For instance, Congress has refused to pass those 2010 IMF the reform package.
Dan, are the two sides on the same page? You have written that the economic relationship between the US and China has been mutually beneficial, still is.
Yes.
But you also say that something changed in the second half of George W. Bush's presidency. What changed?
Well, yes, the relationship has been cooperative, and the words that we just heard President Obama speak, it's almost as if there are two narratives, one that's being delivered to Americans and one that's being delivered to the world. And what he was talking about was in the context of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiation, and he's trying to convince primarily members of his own party to embrace the idea of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's having a hard time doing that on the economic merits, so he is resorting to this characterizing the global economy as an us versus them proposition, which is a political tool. I kind of hope and maybe expect that the president calls China up after that and says, hey, just kidding, don't take that too seriously. But going back to the Bush administration, China joined the WTO at the end of 2001. It had agreed to more reforms than any other government in history had ever had to incorporate. So when there were calls for bringing China to the WTO on its failure to comply with certain obligations, the Bush administration said, no, we need to have a honeymoon period here. We need to allow China time to adjust. But I think, by the 2006 or so, the honeymoon period expired. There was a lot of calls for making China accountable to intellectual property accusations and other protectionist accusations. So more cases were brought at the WTO. But I think it really changed primarily after the Great Recession. I mean, at that point, the U.S. was wondering, we're growing at a snail's pace. We are heavily in debt. A lot of that debt is owned by the Chinese government. But China, on the other hand, has been growing at double digits still. What did they do right? What did we do wrong? And we started thinking that maybe we needed to be a little tougher on China, bring more trade remedy measures, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and safeguards. Maybe embrace industrial policy and emulate what China has been doing. I've been suggesting that the United States has nothing to learn from China in that regard. But the media puts a lot of stock and pays a lot of attention to the points of controversy between the U.S. and China. Most of it is collaborative, cooperative, and above board. It's just that it's not that sexy. It's not that appealing to the media.
Right, Adrian, what's your view in that? Is President Obama talking to two different audiences here? One is a domestic audience, as I mentioned, that was the State of the Union address. And when he talks to China, of course, there will be a different tone.
Oh, absolutely, he's talking to two different audiences. And if you heard what he said, he was doing exactly that. And in one sentence, he says, we must make sure that we're protecting our jobs, our workers, our people. And then he said, we must level the playing field. We must help to level the playing field, which are slightly at tension with each other. He's saying that we must have an open, free trading system in which nobody is protecting anybody, and I think he's absolutely right to be doing that. So he's almost contradicting himself within the space of a single sentence. But you know, there are problems with China. It's not just a protectionist, backward-looking United States trying to prevent the rise of China. You do have intellectual property theft of a massive scale in China. You do have protectionism going on in China. We do have to keep putting pressure on China, as well as China putting pressure on America. And we do have to keep reiterating the arguments that this is this awful cliche, but it's a win-win proposition that both sides can benefit from open, free markets and honest, non-corrupt markets. It's a difficult thing particularly for Barack Obama in a democracy to sell, because many people are having a tough time. Many people think that their loss of jobs is to do with the rise of China, and the benefits from an open global trading system are widely dispersed. The pain and the loss is much more concentrated. So you can get interest groups, mobilizing to stop the opening up of trade. But I would agree with our previous speaker that on the whole, the really big story is how well China has been accommodated into the global trading system, how much progress has been made in the last few years, and how much huge advances have been made in creating a global WTO-governed trading system.
Dr. Chen, does China acknowledge that there are these concerns, which the United States has very valid concerns, about China, the fact that there could be dumping, that China could be subsidizing industries, there could be currency manipulation? Does China understand the concerns that the U.S. has?
Domestic politics from both sides have its impact on their economic relationship. I think that with the upcoming presidential elections, for instance, in the United States, any kind of statement or speech from the White House, they will have to face the two audience, their domestic audience as well as the international audience. I think that those concerns from the domestic peoples, which are worried about the competitive edge of China's economy and its impact on those industries of the United States, their voice will be heard and will be addressed. At the same time, I think from Chinese side, we are also quite concerned about some of those pressures and also some of those unfair treatment to Chinese companies which are interested in investment in the United States.
Right.
And I think that both those domestic industry have their complaints about that. But anyway, I think that as long as those the leadership between two sides, as well as we have 90 plus of those communication channels working, I think a working group, working levels will make it quite workable. I think that those problems could be addressed quite efficiently.
Dan, we hear the concerns being expressed in the United States. In fact, the U.S. Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker said recently that massive U.S. investment in China will stop unless these concerns are met. But the United States is not entirely innocent either, is it?
Well, no. There's a litany of complaints in the United States about Chinese behavior, Chinese practices, intellectual property theft, currency manipulation, subsidization of industries, dumping. We have mechanisms to resolve those complaints, and by and large, many of them have been resolved. But the United States also has a history of sort of pushing the envelope on the rules. And I think China, to a certain extent, learned from the United States. Really, technically, you're not guilty of affronting, of violating your obligations until a WTO panel has come to that conclusion. And the United States has used protectionism in the past to accomplish domestic political objectives. The steel tariffs that President Bush had in 2002 and 2003 had a domestic purpose. The tire safeguards that President Obama imposed in 2009, the same sort of thing. Interestingly, at the WTO, most cases that the U.S. has brought against China, the U.S. has won, and China has complied. Most cases that China has brought against the United States, China has won, and the U.S. has complied. But overall, of all the governments, of all the countries in the WTO, the U.S. is more likely to be out of compliance, to have not complied with a WTO ruling than any other country. So we live to a certain extent in a glass house, and we need to lead by example if we expect that
That's right.
kind
The
of
highest
compliance.
number of complaints brought at the WTO has been about the U.S.
That's correct.
Something like 119, right?
That's right.
More than any other country.
Right. Well, I mean, the U.S. has the largest economy, so
Right.
there's more surface area
Yeah.
for disputes. But
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now. More with our panel right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.